Today on CityCast Philly, hundreds of apartments are being built on Front Street in the Fishtown and Kensington neighborhoods. This housing boom is all happening near the noisy Market Frankford train line, but the L has seen fewer riders since the pandemic. So could these new apartments attract more Philadelphians back on SEPTA? It's Wednesday, January 10th. I'm Trinina Ree, and here's what Philly's talking about. Joining me is Jake Bloomgard, real estate reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Welcome back to CityCast Philly.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jake, I'm curious, why are we seeing a housing boom happening, near the L in North Philly now? Why are developers making a big bet on these neighborhoods under the L?
I think the short version of this is that the Fishtown area has become so developed in recent years that any kind of large vacant lots in the neighborhood have been filled in. And so Front Street for a long time, has kind of had a lot of vacancy, a lot of empty buildings, a lot of big empty lots. And so essentially some of the developers I talked to were saying that they had never really thought of trying to build anything there. But at a certain point, the Fishtown neighborhood had become so popular and the demand for people living there had become so high that essentially it was like the only place left where they could build.
We'll talk more about the neighborhood in just a bit. But Jake, can you kind of paint us a picture? How much construction is going on right now?
It's really astounding when you walk under the train line. I've been wanting to do this story for at least a year just because, I don't live in that area, but every time I've gone there, I often take the L because I live in South Philly and I get off and I walk around a bit. Just the sheer number of construction sites under the L, it honestly makes it kind of hard to walk because they're kind of expanding onto the sidewalk and there's just construction equipment and the fences they have up around, the work sites and things like that. So you kind of have to zigzag across the street in various places because they're building so much at the same time. And it's really an astounding change. I should also highlight that it's essentially this 1 mile stretch between the Girard and York Dauphin stops on the L. And it really is just very eye-catching because it's right up next to this huge transit line. And if you're walking underneath the L, you kind of can't really talk while a train is going over top of you.
Yes, I know that. It's like, wait, hold on. I gotta pause for a second while the train runs by.
Exactly. In fact, while I was doing this story, I was talking to some of the developers under the L. And as I was recording our conversations, we would just have to pause periodically because the roar of the train was so loud.
But doesn't this neighborhood kind of compare to the L on the West Philly side? So we're talking between 46th and 69th Street along Market Street.
Yeah, definitely. But we haven't seen as much construction so far along that stretch of the L. There's a couple of reasons for that, but really the principal reason is that the Fishtown neighborhood has arguably changed more than any other neighborhood in the city over the last 10 years or so. It's, I would say, one of the only neighborhoods that you can really compare to something like Washington, D.C. or Brooklyn or something like that, where the gentrification, reinvestment, whatever you want to call it, is so radical that the neighborhood just barely looks the same 10 years after it's kind of started. And you can really see that in the median income in the neighborhood has spiked radically. It used to be a pretty working class neighborhood. Now it is much more comprised of upper middle class professionals. And the census data shows that in combination with some of the other neighborhoods around there to the immediate south, it's now the kind of highest median income neighborhood in the city, more than Chestnut Hill.
Wow. Okay. More on the housing boom under the L train in North Philly after a quick break. This is CityCast Philly. Jake, I want to talk about what these actual new apartments are going to start looking like. Are they multi-unit complexes? Are they townhomes? And what are some of the amenities that they're offering?
So it's mostly multifamily apartments, not as many townhomes, although there are some smaller projects. I also talked to some developers who are doing much smaller, kind of like two, three, four, 5 unit buildings. Those are often more where they're like renovating an older historic building that has like a store on the front level and then apartments above. But where the bulk of these units is coming from, probably obviously, is these massive new apartment buildings, which are going to be hundreds of units sometimes. And one of the key amenities they're trying to provide is a kind of retail experience on the ground floor. So they look at what happened in Fishtown over on the Frankfurt Avenue side, and there was a lot of developers who kind of tried to seed the area with kind of like nice restaurants and bars and coffee shops and things that people will like to go to and maybe even come from outside of the neighborhood to go to.
So, like building up the storefronts along the avenues.
Exactly, exactly. So what the developers on Front Street are really trying to do is provide a lot of retail space to attract more restaurateurs, more bars, more coffee shops. There's one spot called Row Home Coffee, which I really quite like. It's at 2152 North Front Street. And I really like it there because they have these breakfast sandwiches that they do on like a pretzel roll and like nice coffee and things like that. And every time I've been, it's been full. They have a takeout window. And like when they first were in business during the pandemic, one of the developers was telling me that they like had a line down the block. And that's kind of when he really realized that there was this built-in like desire already in the neighborhood for like more amenities and more retail experience.
The big question for soon to be residents would be what's the rent looking like?
So I should emphasize that I have not talked to every developer who's building under the L. So there could be some affordable units in here that I'm not aware of. But I think most of these buildings are going to be more like market rate. And by which I mean, rents probably in the 1,600 and like 2,000 a month like range, if not more in some cases. And again, I did not talk to like every developer, so I am not 100% sure. But generally speaking, they're charging rents that probably would be most accessible to kind of like middle to upper middle class professionals, as opposed to, what might be more accessible to like older folks or more working class residents who are perhaps historically in these neighborhoods.
So, speaking of the rent and the economics behind all of this, you wrote in your report that these apartments are just a 10-minute walk from the L station. So, York Dolphin, Berks, and Girard. Does this boom mean more people could start to ride SEPTA more?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, as you mentioned at the start of the show, SEPTA ridership is radically lower than it was before the pandemic. And certainly some of that is due to the social conditions on the L. The Market Frankfurt line goes through the Kensington neighborhood where there's a lot of, especially north of Lehigh Avenue, a lot of open air drug markets and kind of the heart of the opioid crisis, not just in the city, but in the region. And so there's often, folks on the L who are struggling with homelessness and addiction and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's a very different experience than like riding the metro in Washington, D.C. or something like that. But I think, honestly, probably an even bigger problem is the remote and hybrid work trends. Because I think, about myself, and I'm someone who feels very comfortable riding public transit pretty much all the time. But now I go to work in the office a lot less. And so I ride SEPTA a lot less. And that's really the heart of the problem. And you think, again, we're talking about the people who can afford these units. There's going to be some of them who work in like healthcare or maybe construction or something like that, where those are jobs where you obviously have to be in person every day. But there's also going to be a lot of them who might work in like tech jobs or something like that, where either you're going to be completely remote or you're only going to the office a couple days a week. And so the appeal of an amenity like mass transit line right next to your house might be a little less. On the other hand, it is the fastest way to get from these neighborhoods to downtown. If you like just walk up and you happen to catch a train right as it arrives, you can get from these neighborhoods to downtown in like 5-10 minutes. It's amazing, you know? And then also, if you're trying to go to like West Philly, where Penn and Drexel and all that is, that's also an extremely fast ride. And that's a big job cluster. And what some of these developers were saying to me is like, yes, people aren't going to the office like every day of the week, but they still do need to go to Center City. They still do need to go to the office a few days a week. And so that amenity will still get used, especially because the cost of like rideshare or something like that is very expensive these days.
Interesting points. Jake, you cover new development in the city. So this housing boom is happening, though under a noisy train, not a lot of parking. You also mentioned the open drug use in some parts of these neighborhoods. Are all of these amenities, including the access to public transportation, going to be enough to attract soon-to-be renters to these neighborhoods?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think we're all about to find out. The developers I talked to, honestly, I think what makes them the most nervous is that all of this construction is happening at the same time. And that like a lot of the buildings are probably, targeting a very similar demographic. So if they're all going to start renting at the exact same time, that could make it pretty hard for them to rent at the prices they want to.
Oh, you're talking about competition here.
Oh, yeah. And this is not just happening in this neighborhood. There's a few neighborhoods in Philly that have been seeing an enormous amount of apartment construction all at the same time.
I'm thinking like American Street in North Philly. There's a boom over there too.
Yep. No Libs, Center City. In the end, it kind of is going to depend on how attractive the Fishtown neighborhood is. And honestly, considering the trends we've been seeing there, I think these guys actually have a better chance than a lot of people do, just because there is so much amazing restaurants and nightlife and everything in Fishtown. And it is such an attractive neighborhood. And it's probably the neighborhood that people who live outside the city, if they're going to move here from a place like New York or LA or something, that's like the neighborhood they probably like look at.
All right. That was Jake Blumgart, real estate reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Jake, a pleasure to have you on CityCast Philly.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Check out Jake's full story in our show notes. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this episode about the housing boom near the L train, share this with a friend. Rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.